Thom Andersen es director de cine, crítico, historiador y profesor del California Institute of the Arts.
Thank you very much. I think I should concentrate on the programs that are happening next week rather than the programs that have already been projected. Should I stop for translation?
No, it's here directly. They are...
It's simultaneous translation.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
So you all understood what I said? Okay, great. Sorry, we don't have high-tech stuff like this. Simon Rodia, or Sam Rodia, from the 1930s until the 1950s. And there also, there's a scene in Los Angeles Plays itself which shows the Watts Towers as photographed by Andy Warhol in his Los Angeles movie, which was also his first movie, which is called Tarzan and Jane Regain, sort of. I think in that movie, I said that in the 1960s they were the most accessible civic landmark in the world, but they weren't really a civic landmark. They, in a certain way, they've come to symbolize Los Angeles. There are these, if you're not familiar, there are these kind of three spires. They were all made of junk material by a single person, an immigrant laborer, and something that he did in his spare time, and it took him 20 years to make. And they symbolize, in a way, among other things, the passage of Christopher Columbus to America. The towers represent the three ships. Originally a small town south of downtown Los Angeles, which wasn't until the 1920s an independent community, unincorporated. That is, it didn't have a city government. It was part of the county of Los Angeles, but it wasn't a separate governmental agency. And it was also one of the few places in Southern California where African Americans were allowed to reside. In those days, there were strict, what they were called covenants that controlled housing, and not only blacks but Latinos and even Jews were excluded from living in some neighborhoods. So there was this institutionalized segregation as opposed to the unofficial segregation that exists today. So there were, but in those days, Watts was a mixed community of blacks, Latinos, also Anglos, and of course, Rodia was an Italian immigrant, first generation. And then it was actually annexed to the city of Los Angeles in 1925, precisely because there was a fear that it would become if it were to become a separate municipality with a separate government, it would be a city controlled by blacks, because they represented by then a majority of the population. Culturally, it's one of the richest communities in Los Angeles. It happens that many of the great jazz musicians from Los Angeles grew up in Watts, such as Charlie Mingus, Hampton Hawes, Big J. McNeely, and also most important Chicana artist, Judy Baca, who created the largest mural probably in the world. The Great Wall also grew up in Watts. So Rodia built these towers, and then one day in 1953 he simply abandoned them. He just gave them to his neighbor and moved to Northern California. By that time, they had already become kind of a quite well-known example of folk art. They were already considered by some critics to be a masterpiece. But that didn't move the city government. So in 1958, they decided that they were going to tear them down. But it happened that a few people, a few citizens of Los Angeles, kind of middle-class people, not rich art patrons, but just regular folks like ourselves, had formed a group called the Friends of the Watts Towers to save them. And they didn't have any money to preserve them, but they just kind of tried to make people understand their significance, their importance. So the Friends of the Watts Towers organized a kind of demonstration. They hired an engineer who had determined that actually they were quite well constructed. That although he had no formal training in engineering, he had actually built these structures that were not only beautiful, but quite well engineered. So they organized a test where they attached these big cables to the towers and had some truck try to pull them down. And the towers withstood the test, which of course surprised the engineers and the city government. So the efforts of the city to destroy the towers were at that time foiled. And finally then they were able to interest the city in taking over the towers, maybe by the late during the 1960s, they were just there. And anybody could come and walk around and actually even climb on the towers if you wanted. They were completely accessible. And you might have noticed, if you saw Los Angeles Plays itself, that in Warhol's film, he shoots Taylor Mead and Naomi Levine kind of cavorting around the towers, and Taylor Mead is almost naked. So it's not something that you could do in any sort of official landmark, but it wasn't at that time. So finally the city decided, okay, we will assume control over the towers, and they built next to them a community art gallery called the Watts Towers Art Center as a gallery, and a gallery particularly for the black artists of Los Angeles, and also as a workshop for offering art classes to people who lived in the community, which at that time was almost exclusively black neighborhood.